So I used to know a guy who made his living selling hips and knees. John was a salesman. I guess you'd have to be if your biggest sellers were in fact replacement parts for your body. I'm not talking about the main engines, right? John was more the Tate Boys version of the medical world, known for selling high-quality shocks and struts. John was a brilliant man. In order to be more effective and efficient, John worked side by side the doctors who performed the procedures that used his wares. John learned anatomy, surgical procedures, a highly specialized vocabulary, how to read charts and x-rays, and in so doing became a respected partner in the medical field. He didn't have a white coat, per se, but the people who did respected him. I first met John shortly after what some might consider an incident in his life that had him putting his money where his mouth was, replacing his own joints with the synthetic ones he sold. When it came time for him to do so, there was only one man that he would trust with the job, the doctor who believed in him from the beginning, his friend, and as fate would have it, his brother. Recovery was going well for John. I'd see him now again at church, painting baseboards and trim as he sipped on iced tea in one hand and had the brush in the other. Not a drop cloth in sight. John made using a brush look effortless. And I'd joke with him every time that I'd see him that he'd missed his calling in life. But then things got serious when we were going back and forth, and I finished one of the quotes he was using to shut me up when I told him he needed to get a hobby. It was then in that moment that we realized that we loved the same movies. And while John's trade rested on his word, his passion was fishing. And perhaps one of the most quintessential movies that portrays a deeply romantic reflection of life connected to water has to be Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It. The quote that tied us together was something like that all Christ's disciples were fishermen, and that Christ's favorite, John, was a dry fly fisherman. And so, even though today's gospel talks about Peter, I think of John. I think of John when I tie off lines, bait hooks, and how I love the church. I think about the difference between baiting and fishing. How the church is supposed to be fishers of men or fish for people. And I wonder if fishing really has something to do with selling a good idea, or if the metaphor really is about defining the relationship between attraction and abundance. And maybe I'm missing the point altogether. One thing I do know is that as much as I loved seeing my friend in church, he had been for a long time disillusioned with it. And that weighed heavily on my heart. He'd say to me, Nick, the church has changed so much. I hardly recognize it anymore. He'd kind of go into himself and he'd say, there was a time, and he'd go off, and then he'd come circling back around some hurt that left him more willing to scrape baseboards than to sit in the pews. And I wondered, really, what brought him back in those moments? What drew him back to church? What attracted him? What sold the salesman on his return and kept him coming there when all of his friends were out doing different things on Sunday mornings? I mean, given the choice of painting trim and participating in the Eucharist, I'd choose Eucharist every time. But if John was being real with you, he'd much rather be out fishing. Then I realized something. It wasn't about me or even painting or praying. It was about listening to John, listening to his encounter with disillusionment and overcoming loss, and then sitting there holding it with him. It was about John finding the beauty once again in fishing holes that folks considered all fished out, holding on to the hope that one day, despite the predictions of many, a fish would rise. And in some sense, all it takes for such risings to happen is a switch in tactics, whether you use nets, poles, or the gospel, I think. I used to have a boss named Skip when I first started working, and Skip loved to fish for trout. So much so that most of the days he'd begin with instructions on how to stalk them from the riverbank, rather than telling us what we had to do for the day. Invariably, he'd end the instruction with the sort of knowledge that a bad day fishing was better than a good day at work. But that's not always the case. In the story given to us this morning, Peter is frustrated. He's disillusioned. I guess you could say that since his job was fishing, the whole work-passion metaphor doesn't really work here. Fair enough. But changing the tactic certainly did, right? When Jesus said, "Put your nets down on the other side of the boat," and the guys did it begrudgingly, right? Something miraculous happened. The marvelous catch of fish. Casting, according to Jesus, worked, despite the fact that they had been fishing the same waters. The haul, the story tells us, was so great that release had to become part of the equation, and with it, the knowledge that it's okay to let things go, because sometimes holding on to it will end up sinking you if you do. And then there's that fear bit. And we know the old trope that we're told not to 366 times in the Bible. That's one for each day and one for no reason at all. I think that's where John was when I left him, somewhere between platitudes and learning how to actually lay things down. He was dealing with his own fears as he slowly approached a landscape that had changed so much. The church had changed. So had he. But the waters hadn't. Towards the end of his book, McLean writes, "Eventually all things merge into one, and a river runs through it." Sometimes that merge is it's what's frightening for us. And I cannot forget how McLean ends his novel, saying in effect that he remains haunted by waters. The fact is, John was too. Not knowing, I guess, where he fit anymore. And if there has ever been a tragedy more real in this world, it has to be found in a reality where folks think that they aren't wanted anymore. Or worse yet, that they have nothing to offer and are not needed, left somehow unloved and misunderstood. For nothing is further from the truth. God will use you. As a matter of fact, I think God already has. Though the net remains ultimately in your hands. You know, I'll end with this. One day before I left from Pensacola to come here, John came up to me. We were getting ready to go on the parish retreat to Weeks Bay. And he told me, he's like, Nick, I'm going to bring my net. We'll catch mullet. Mullet's like a bait fish, right? Have you ever used one? To which I said, a net? No, never have used a net. Don't fear. There it is. I'll show you. And as he said that, he sort of looked past me. I think that the bay was taking shape in his mind. And it was there on the banks of his memory, I think, that he remembered why he had come back to church. The same reason all fishermen return to holes that have been good to them. I think he was hoping again. There are those of us who will approach these streams that were once teeming with life in hopes of encountering a legend. A legend waiting for all of us to encounter. The legends of legends, that fish that all fishermen wish to catch. But in doing so, we'll need to remember that there is a catch. And that is that sometimes the bait that's used to attract those fishes, or that fish, sometimes changes depending on what time of day you go fishing. It's hard to crack that nut at first. It's a trust thing. Kind of like approaching this old man, this delusioned old man, sipping iced tea, painting baseboards, listening to him. But by the time you realize that you're doing that, you're already talking to him. You're caught up in it, as it were, in his story, hearing his take on Jesus, and thinking, so who's the fish now?